The next law the Department of State has in our curriculum is 1964 Civil Rights Act. This landmark law prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, sex, or national origin in schools, jobs, voting, or public places, but it did not explicitly mention housing. This landmark law, 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act, did explicitly mention housing and protected people for the first time based on national origin and religion. This 1968 Act of Congress prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, or national origin. This is a historic photo taken at the 1964 Seattle World's Fair, and it has been colorized because in those days most photos were black and white. Although housing discrimination was illegal, the government had no true enforcement power until the momentous 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act. The question is, how do you remember this law? Because you do have to remember it for the test. So I always ask my students, who was president in the 1960s? Who was president in the 1960s? Most people say Kennedy, even though we did have other presidents who served in office in the 1960s. But most people say Kennedy. Kennedy happened to be America's only Irish Catholic president. After he died, housing law protected everyone's national origin and religion. So he was Irish Catholic, national origin, religion. This next slide is a historic photo showing the swearing-in of the new president after the loss of John Kennedy, with Mrs. Kennedy at his side in attendance. President Johnson was the one who managed to get the Federal Fair Housing Act passed, and he signed it into law. Let's speak a little bit further about Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968, I just want you to know it is also Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act. And the reason that they give it a distinct name is because it would be very confusing if they kept calling everything the Civil Rights Act, updated. And I think also they wanted to dramatize that this was a very powerful step forward, and that this was a law that was significant unto itself, even though it was just an addition to the Civil Rights Act that is ongoing. We already know that 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act protects people on the basis of national origin and religion, but it also has some other very interesting provisions. The law also forbids mortgage discrimination, such as a bank or a lender, private lender possibly, refusing to make or purchase a loan, setting different loan terms, like rates or fees, for different types of people, setting different loan requirements, or refusing loan information, or appraising in a discriminatory way. Interestingly, the 1866 Civil Rights Act mentioned every possible thing that you could do with real estate, but it neglected to mention banks. It did not mention mortgages. So that situation was rectified by Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act, which is 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act. So we have our ongoing list here to help you keep track of the laws. We have just added 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act. You will notice that there are no protected groups under 1964 Civil Rights Act because, as we mentioned earlier, that law did not directly apply to housing, and this is a real estate course. The next law we have to look at is 1974 Housing and Community Development Act. Now, this law initiated a lot of programs that we are familiar with today. It introduced Section 8, low-income subsidized housing, urban homesteading, which we know means rehabilitating abandoned buildings, community development grants, which are sometimes called block grants, and it also created National Institute of Building Sciences. Interestingly, the main thing this law is remembered for was just a detail at the time. It happened as an aside to mention equal rights in housing law regardless of gender. So this is the law that specifically gave women equal rights in real estate. You know I enjoy including historic photos, and the top photo is a historic photo of a protest of a beauty contest. On the bottom is a photo I took of an actual beauty contest today. Now, with regard to 1974 Housing and Community Development Act, I want to point out that when we refer to gender in 1974, we are talking about women's rights, not gender identity, which is covered by a 2019 New York State law. So now we can add this last law to our list that shows date, name of law, and protected group. Well, here's me being silly again. My students send me pictures of their pets all the time, and so I like to include their pet photos in my presentations if I can, just for a little bit of levity. I never include photos of people's children, because we have to protect people's children. So let's move on. Here, I am showing a picture of a little girl, but I can assure you this little girl is 25 years old now. So I don't think we have to worry too much about showing her identity. We are introducing a new law here, 1988 Amendment to Federal Fair Housing Act. So you will recall the original Federal Fair Housing Act was 1968. This is 1988. This law protects against discrimination in housing based on family status. The term family status does not refer to marriage, which is not protected by federal law, interestingly, but by state law. Family status refers to kids. Families can be prevented from renting space based on number of people per square foot, but according to federal law, not based on number of children. Building code occupancy rules are for safety, so that would dictate the number of people per square feet. This law also affects our sensitivity to the way that we express ourselves. We never want to say, many families live in this building, because that could be construed as discriminatory. But you could say, this building has a children's playroom. Isn't this a beautiful playroom? This is one of the most beautiful playrooms I've ever seen. This very same law, 1988 Amendment to Federal Fair Housing Act, had a second very interesting and important provision, which is it prohibited discrimination against disabled persons in real estate. And further, it allowed disabled tenants to make what we call reasonable modifications to rental apartments at their own expense. That would be things like ramps, grab bars, wider doors, and stuff like that. Reasonable accommodations, which is a completely different term, accommodations are actions, not physical changes like modifications. Reasonable accommodations would be things like reading information aloud to blind people or showing architectural plans to persons who cannot visit a construction site. I promise you, the 1988 Amendment to Federal Fair Housing Act is always on the licensing test. I don't know why, but Department of State just loves to ask about it. So please remember it. Now, I got to tell you the truth. Over the years, I have done everything to get my students to remember this law. And for some reason, they found it very difficult to remember. So I finally figured out a kind of a goofy way, but I finally figured out a goofy way to remember this law. And it's the next slide. The law covers, or protects, disabled people who are sometimes in wheelchairs and little kids who are sometimes in strollers. Well, what do wheelchairs and strollers have in common? Well, if you look at the next page, the 8s in 1988 look like wheels. Wheelchairs have wheels, strollers have wheels, 1988 has wheels. So if you can remember the wheels, you got this law. It cannot be overstated how important this law was in protecting the two groups of disabled and children. Over 60 million Americans are disabled, and most disabilities are not visible. Only about 3.3 million use a wheelchair. Here I have a photo with my best friend Denise, who does happen to use a wheelchair. I thought you might like to see some statistics on this. This is information from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and it states that 1 in 4 adults in the United States have some type of disability. And this next infometric, also from CDC, shows the types of disability that are most common. Once again, we have here our list of laws, our running list.